Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam, and I am a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years, and I am a writer, and my training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. I want to do a follow-up video on a video I did, I think, a couple times ago on this idea of univocality. I talked in that video about what univocality is, where it comes from, why we do it as interpreters of the Bible, and as we practice theology and all that kind of stuff. And so the natural next step is to ask the question, because it's the reason I did that video was because I was watching on TikTok over and over again Bible scholars coming on and saying you cannot presuppose univocality on the text and all that kind of stuff. And you start seeing people kind of go, and then this one guy gets on there and he goes, well, it's not a doctrine of the church, univocality is. And it's like, well, it kind of comes from that. And so we just need to be honest and why we do what we do when we practice univocality. And so I wanted to kind of explore why it is that biblical scholars, not all of them, but especially the ones who are on social media apps, who are talking about, you can't use univocality, you cannot presuppose univocality. That's a problem in understanding the Bible and reading the Bible correctly, all that kind of stuff. Why they're saying that? Okay, so here's the deal. I'm just gonna answer this question the best way I know how, and it all has to do with presuppositions. Now, I know some biblical scholars who would tell you, I don't have any presuppositions. I don't come to the text with any presuppositions. That's flat out false. Okay, that is false. Every person who approaches the text of the Bible, every single one of us comes to the Bible, approaches the Bible with a set of presuppositions. I do it. Other pastors do it. Biblical scholars do it. Apologists do it. We all have our own presuppositions, our own set of rules, framework that we use when reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible. Every single one of us. As I had a professor who used to say, every single one of you comes with your rose-colored glasses on, and you always point at each other and say, no, yours are blue, and yours are... No, you all have your own version of them on, and we all see the text through them, right? And so we just need to know that every single person comes to the text with presuppositions, so even biblical scholars. And so I want to kind of walk through some of the presuppositions that biblical scholars bring to the text to help us understand why they cannot or they cannot presuppose univocality. Their rules that they bring to interpreting the text, reading the text, understanding the text of the Bible, their framework does not allow for univocality. It just doesn't. And I'm going to show you why, because of their interpretive and their philosophical rules, their presuppositions that they bring into their study does not allow it. Okay. And so here's what it is. And then I want to talk about what I think really is the case. Okay. So, these are what I see. There's four main guiding principles or presuppositions of critical biblical scholarship. And I think they would all agree with these. Okay. I don't think any of them would be like, whoa, you mischaracterized biblical scholarship. I think they would be like, yeah, all those things is why we can't presuppose univocality. But then I want to talk about why I think we probably should have univocality at a certain level. Okay, and I want to talk through that at the end. Okay, so here's these four guiding presuppositions. Okay, number one, the first one is this: as a critical scholar, the Bible is first and foremost a text to be analyzed, critiqued, and peer-reviewed. And what I mean by peer-reviewed is like by ancient texts from the same time and space and general area that they were in. And it's not a text to approach through faith and belief first. Okay, so to a Bible scholar, as they view the text, the very first thing that they are doing is they are looking at this as a text to be analyzed, critiqued. They're going to take outside sources and try to review and peer review it and critique it that way. That's their mindset. That's their presupposition. That's their first job, is to look at it that way, not as a text that needs to be approached through faith or belief or any of that, like devotionally. Now, a lot of Bible scholars actually have a pretty robust faith, but they learn how to separate those two things, and they say, okay, this is my scholarship, and this is how I do this, and this is the separation of my faith over here. And they try not to make those two meet. I don't know how they do it, but they do that. So not all critical Bible scholars are going to approach the text and say, you know what, I'm never going to look at this from a devotional standpoint. I'm never going to look at this through my faith. They don't. Not all of them do that. A few do they're only about the critical scholarly thing about the Bible. And here's the deal: this does not mean they don't love the Bible. It doesn't mean they don't love this text. A lot of these critical scholars have given their entire lives to studying the text of this Bible. And so we need to understand that it's not like they hate Christians. They hate the Bible. They don't. That's not the deal. They love this text and they've given their life to it. Their presupposition, though, is it's their job to analyze, first and foremost, to analyze the text and critique the text and try to figure out all these bigger things that are going on and figure out where to position it in time. Is this true? Is this not true? Is this really a person here? Is this a myth? Their whole job is to do that. So that is their first presupposition. As they approach the text, they are asking that question: what am I analyzing here? Okay, so that's number one. Secondly, as a critical scholar, the second presupposition or guiding framework rule is I must suspend any form of supernatural because it cannot be tested, critiqued, or reproduced over and over again. Now, like I said, this isn't every single Bible scholar. There's a lot of Bible scholars who would say, no, the supernatural has to be there because it's in the text. This is a supernatural filled text. Like there's all kinds of supernatural in it. So we need to kind of approach it that way. But a lot of the ones who are on social media, what we find is that they say, no, we cannot have the supernatural because it cannot be tested, it can't be critiqued, it can't be reproduced. We can't make that happen again. And so this is the guiding principle: is we have to suspend any form of supernatural in it because we can't test that. There's no data in that. Empirical data must take precedence because that can be physically known, it can be tested, it can be agreed upon. We can go out, we can dig up things, we can find things, we can see it, we can test it with our own hands and eyes and minds and all that kind of stuff. And so that's a guiding presupposition for a biblical scholar. They're going to say, you know what, we cannot reproduce the supernatural, so we need to suspend that, and we need to go after a different definition, something that's more tangible, kind of a deal. Okay, so that's the guiding presupposition number two, and that really has a lot to do with univocality, and I'll get to that in a second. Number three, the Bible must be viewed in its original manuscript form as it was originally written, and each text must be allowed to be an end in themselves. Okay? Any authority the text has is actually in its individuality, not in its canonization. And so the Bible scholar's presupposition is we need to deconstruct, basically, the Bible into its individual parts and study them into their individual parts, not as a whole. We're not going to look at this as this, canonized whole thing, but we would take this out and this out and just deconstruct the Bible back to its original manuscript form and ask, what does this manuscript say? What does this manuscript say? What does this manuscript say? And look at them individually, because the authority, to them, the authority is not in the canonization of the whole, but in its individual parts, okay? And you see that over and over again, and that's another big deal of why this guiding presupposition of why univocality cannot be a thing, because it's like, well, that's not the way it originally existed, so they didn't even operate like that sometimes, most of the time. Number four, the guiding presupposition would be that words and texts actually have no inherent meaning to them. Okay, we assign meaning to them. They only gain meaning when a collective group gathers together, interprets them together, assigns meaning to them, and then allows that to speak as an authority to them. And so a lot of scholars that I've read, heard, know, that they would say the exact same thing. They would say that, well, the text doesn't have a meaning to it. Like the Bible, you pick it up and doesn't have a meaning to it. And he goes, here's how you test this. The way that you would test that is give it to somebody and ask them to read it and tell them what it means. you may not get that very easily. It needs to be interpreted, right? And so that's the whole point of it. So I think those are the four guiding principles, the guiding presuppositions of biblical scholarship. It's a text to be analyzed and critiqued first and foremost. We have to suspend the supernatural because we can't reproduce that, and we can't really test that. It has to be viewed in manuscript form, not in canonization form, because the authority is actually in its individuality. And then words and text have no inherent meaning behind them. It's only whatever we assign to them. These are the guiding presuppositions of critical biblical scholarship. Now, why does that lend itself to the fact that you cannot presuppose univocality? Well, first and foremost, univocality is built off of this notion that God is working behind the scenes to inspire the whole text. And so if we have to suspend the supernatural, then we cannot assume that inspiration is a thing. We cannot assume, because we can't test that. How do you know what's inspired, what isn't? How do you know that these books that we cast away a long time ago weren't really inspired? Like, there's all these questions that come up, and so we have to suspend the supernatural. So inspiration cannot be a thing, and then therefore infallibility, inerrancy, all that kind of stuff goes out the door with inspiration. And so now there's no way to harmonize. There's no way to univocalize because the thread that was tying it all together is gone. Also, we're analyzing the text here. We're not trying to believe something from it from a biblical scholarship standpoint. And also, the Bible didn't originally come in this form. It wasn't until about late 300s, early 400s that we bound all this together. We canonized it and we said, here is the Bible, right? And so I think that's a decent argument for some of that is like, listen, these were individual manuscripts and with the individual authors that had something individually to say about God, about what was going on there. And so if you take away the supernatural level of it, then we have to do this. We cannot univocalize everything. And then to say on top of it all, and words and text really have no meaning. It's just kind of whatever we read them and assign meaning to them, and then we say to collectively agree on that meaning, and then go from there. That's what gives it meaning and all that kind of stuff. And so what we have to do is we have to negotiate with the text, all that kind of stuff. That last point, though, I will say this. They may not, the text, the Bible, may not have meaning, inherent meaning, but Paul had inherent meaning. James had inherent meaning. Peter had inherent meaning. The writers of these texts had inherent meaning. They definitely did because they had a reason why they wrote them. I often use the illustration that if I wrote my wife a coded letter with all kinds of insider jargon that only she would know, and that letter kind of got lost, and then someone found it 300 years from now, and they picked it up and they just started reading through it, they might conclude, wow, this doesn't mean anything. And to them, it might not. It might not mean anything. But if they really want to understand the text, they're going to try to figure out who I was. And they're going to figure out who my wife was and what was going on maybe during the time in our family, in our life, in the country we lived in the city we lived in, all that kind of stuff. They try to figure out all of those things to go, okay, why did he write this letter this way? What does this mean? What does this mean? What did he mean by this to the... See, because I have inherent meaning in the text that I wrote to the person I wrote it to. It may not mean anything to the person who found it 300 years from now. They may read meaning back into it and go, oh, well, he wrote this. This speaks to me. I may not have been trying to speak to them at all. I may just be speaking to my wife. And so we can't just say it doesn't have any inherent meaning, but we can't assume that the inherent meaning is for us. We need to read it as if it wasn't for us at first, and then try to draw meaning out of it later on, okay? And so to say just blanket statement like words don't have inherent meaning, and I get that argument, but like texts don't have inherent meaning, I don't really see that argument. I think authors have inherent meaning when they write texts, and when we understand who that author was and why they were writing, who they were writing to, we can understand their meaning. And then we can say, does this have any connections, and does it go beyond just that relationship there? Does it go, can I draw something from this about what I believe, and is there anything to speak to me about this kind of stuff? And so that point I kind of don't really love. So those are, I think, the guiding presuppositions of why they say you can't presuppose univocality. Now, here's what I would say. As someone who has studied theology for a long time and understands the ins and outs of how we build theology, I would say this: at certain points, we have to presuppose some kind of univocality. Now, we cannot force univocality, but we have to presuppose some kind if we are going to do theology and do it well. Now, I will concede a point that we pick and choose. We absolutely 100% pick and choose what theology we are going to build and what theology we're not. We pick and choose parts of the text that agree with this theology as we see it happening in agreement in the text over and over and over again. We don't pick obscure verses and obscure passages that don't really connect with the rest and say, well, we're going to build a theology on that. That's poor doctrine. That's poor theology building. But where the text seems to agree over and over and over and over again about certain things, then we pull those together, and we have a chance then to univocalize those texts because they seem to be in agreement. And so we do negotiate with the text. I would agree with that, and I'll concede that point. But that is a part of univocalization. We use this one voice to build theology, to build doctrine. And we aren't alone in that, because that's what a lot of the New Testament writers did with the Old Testament. That's how they began to build their doctrine. That's how they used their Old Testaments. That's how they used the Hebrew Scriptures to help us understand who the Messiah is. That's how they taught the people in the synagogues. That's what they argued from the Scriptures, and they did it in a univocalized way to help people understand who Jesus was and the theology of the church. That's what they did. Another point about univocalization is Paul wanted some univocalization because he circulated his letters not just to the church he wrote them to, but to other churches around. And so they would match these things together and kind of go, well, this is what Paul's writing and this is what he's writing. Now, sometimes they don't agree. Sometimes they're in disagreement with each other. And we have to see that in the text. We have to see that as that was all unfolding. And that's okay. But where they do agree, we can say, hey, this speaks kind of on one voice in this way, agreeing with this. And it's not just a little blip here and a blip here. It's like over and over and over again. This seems like the voice on this thing that the apostles wanted. Now, the biblical scholar would say, well, we can't do that. That's just what Paul said here in this one instance. To this one church, that's what Paul said here. But to build correct theology, to build doctrine, it's necessary to univocalize things. So I don't think we can do a sweeping univocalization on all of them. I think I'm of the opinion that we should let some of the text just breathe and let them kind of speak on their own. But where we can univocalize, where there is agreement across the board, theologically speaking, doctrinally speaking, that's a good place where we can univocalize. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful in helping understand maybe where a biblical scholar is coming from, where a pastor or someone like that is coming from, where a theologian's coming from, where an apologist is coming from. And here's the deal: every single one of us brings some kind of presupposition to the text. We just do. All right. Well, hope you had a great time with this. I'd love to read your comments in the comment section. Give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.